Violent protests are events characterized by large-scale demonstrations and civil unrest, often involving clashes between protesters and law enforcement or opposing groups. These protests can arise due to various socio-political, economic, or cultural issues and have occurred in different parts of the world throughout history. While protests are a means for people to voice their grievances and demand change, violence can escalate quickly, resulting in injuries, deaths, and property damage. 1. Tiananmen Square protests. China, 1989. Details. The Tiananmen Square protests were a pro-democracy movement that took place in Beijing, China, in 1989. Students and workers gathered in Tiananmen Square to call for political reform and an end to corruption. The Chinese government declared martial law and deployed the military to suppress the protests. On June 3–4, 1989, the military used force to disperse the crowds, resulting in a significant number of casualties and injuries, although the exact death toll remains unknown. The 2nd of May 1968 protests. France. Details. The May 1968 protests in France were a series of widespread demonstrations and strikes by students, workers, and other activists demanding political, social, and economic reforms. The protests led to intense clashes between protesters and the police, with rioting and street battles becoming commonplace. The government eventually implemented significant reforms in response to the unrest. 3. Los Angeles riots. USA, 1992. Details. The Los Angeles riots occurred in 1992 following the acquittal of 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King, an African-American man. The verdict sparked outrage, leading to 6 days of widespread rioting, looting, and arson in Los Angeles. The National Guard and U.S. military were deployed to restore order, but the riots resulted in 63 deaths and over 2,000 injuries. 4. Euromaidan protests. Ukraine, 2013–2014. Details. The Euromaidan protests were a series of pro-European demonstrations that took place in Kyiv, Ukraine, in 2013–2014. The protests were triggered by the Ukrainian government's decision to reject an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. The demonstrations escalated, leading to clashes between protesters and security forces. The situation escalated further, eventually leading to the ousting of the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych. 5. Egyptian Revolution, Egypt, 2011. Details. The Egyptian Revolution, also known as the Arab Spring, was a series of protests and uprisings that swept across Egypt in 2011. The demonstrations called for the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak and an end to his 30-year rule. The protests escalated into violent clashes between protesters and security forces, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. President Mubarak eventually stepped down from power. 6. Gezi Park protests. Turkey, 2013. Details. The Gezi Park protests started as a peaceful sit-in against the government's plans to demolish a park in Istanbul, Turkey, in 2013. The protests quickly expanded to include broader anti-government sentiments, leading to clashes with the police. The government's handling of the protests sparked widespread criticism, and the events led to multiple deaths and injuries. 7. G20 protests. Canada, 2010. Details. The G20 protests took place in Toronto, Canada, in 2010, during a meeting of the Group of 20 G20 leaders. Demonstrators gathered to voice opposition to global economic policies and inequality. However, the protests turned violent, with clashes between protesters and the police, resulting in mass arrests and injuries. 8. 1989 Romanian Revolution. Romania. Details. The Romanian Revolution was a series of protests and riots that led to the overthrow of communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu in 1989. The protests began peacefully but escalated into violence, leading to a deadly confrontation between the military and protesters. Ceausescu was captured and executed, marking the end of his brutal regime. The 9th of May 13 incident. Malaysia, 1969. Details. The May 13 incident was a period of violent racial clashes that occurred in Malaysia in 1969. The unrest followed the country's general election and was fueled by ethnic tensions between Malays and Chinese communities. The clashes resulted in hundreds of deaths and widespread property damage, leading to the declaration of a state of emergency and the suspension of parliamentary democracy. 10 Yellow Vest protests. France, 2018-2019. Details. The Yellow Vest protests, also known as the Gilets-Jaunes movement, were a series of anti-government demonstrations that started in France in 2018. The protesters, initially voicing opposition to fuel tax hikes, demanded broader economic reforms and social justice. The protests often turned violent, with clashes between protesters and law enforcement, leading to injuries and property damage. It is important to note that while protests can be powerful vehicles for social change, the resort to violence often undermines the credibility and effectiveness of these movements. Governments and societies worldwide continue to grapple with the balance between protecting the right to peaceful protest and maintaining law and order during moments of civil unrest.